Alright, hello once again. Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, that's Application and Website Development Program, and in particular the AWD 1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class, I've been doing a series of video presentations based on the book for that class for the fall 2019 semester. The book, as you can see, is Pro-ASP.NET MVC 5. So far, I've done a lecture where I uninstalled Visual Studio 2017 Community Edition and then installed Visual Studio, I uninstalled Visual Studio 2017 Community Edition and installed Visual Studio 2019 Community Edition. In addition, I've done Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, which, as you would guess, brings us to Chapter 3, the MVC Pattern. And the author says, before getting into the details of the ASP.NET MVC framework, he wants to be sure you're familiar with the design pattern. So as you can see right there, there's four things there: the MVC architecture pattern, domain models and repositories, creating loosely coupled systems via the use of DI or dependency injection, and the basis of automated testing. All right. So the author goes through a little bit of a history here of MVC. And again, one thing to realize is MVC is not a new concept. Rather, the use of model view controller has been around for about between 40 and 50 years. All right. However, it's especially well suited for web applications. And as they say right here, and you can see it in the blue, interaction with an MVC app follow a natural cycle. Okay, which fits nicely with the HTTP request and response model. Further, as mentioned, we've talked about this before. MVC, I don't like the author's use of forces a separation of concern. Let's just say it very much welcomes a separation of concerns. All right. The domain model and the controller logic should be decoupled from the user interface. In a web app, as it says, it means the HTML is apart from the rest of the app, which makes maintenance and testing simpler and easier. Many other frameworks utilize MVC. So, in high-level terms, the MVC pattern, as it says, means that an MVC app will be split into a minimum of three pieces. Models, which contain or represent the data that users work with. All right, and I typically refer to those as data stores. They can be simple view models, which represent the data transferred between views and controllers, or domain models. All right, which contain the data of the business domain, the business rules, etc. Views, which, as it says, render some part of the model as a user interface and present it to the user, and controllers, which are multifaceted. They process the incoming request, they perform operations on the model or with the model data, and they select which view to render to the user. It says here, models are the definition of the universe that the application works in. Okay? They're also defined by what they are not responsible for. They don't deal with the UI. They don't deal with processing requests. Again, the idea of rendering the UI, that's the view. The idea of processing the request, that's the controller. As mentioned here, each piece of the MVC architecture is well-defined and self-contained. That leads to that separation of concerns. All right, so understanding the domain model. As it says, the most important part of an MVC app is the domain model. All right, we create the model by identifying the real-world entities known as the domain. We then create a software representation of the domain known as the domain model. Notice, for the purposes of ASP.NET MVC, The domain model is a set of C# types. Typically classes, can be other things. The operations from the domain are represented by the methods defined in these domain types. All right. In short, it says there, a domain model is the single authoritative definition of the business data and processes within an application. A persistent domain, all right, is basically one that is going to last and last. All right. A domain model approach solves many of the problems that arise when maintaining an application. Now, the .NET implementation of MVC. In MVC, controllers are C# classes. Almost always they will derive or inherit from system.web.mvc.controller. Each public method in a class derived from the controller is an action method. When a request is sent to the URL associated with an action method, the controller class basically can figure out what it is to execute. All right. I like this picture because it kind of shows what goes in and what comes out. And you'll notice again, there's no direct communication on this picture between the model and the view. The controller is the conduit or the go-between in this situation. So as it says, the ASP MVC framework uses what's called a view engine. That's the component responsible for processing the view. ASP.NET does not apply any constraints on the implementation of the domain model. Now, comparing MVC to other patterns, as it says, MVC is not the only pattern out there, and as the author says, it's not a catch-all. It may not be perfect for everything. All right. In fact, the author strongly suggests that you make informed and deliberate choices when you actually choose a pattern. All right. They talk here about the Smart UI pattern. It says most programmers have created a Smart UI application. If you've used Windows Forms, you have. Kind of what we did last semester. To build the Smart UI app, you construct the user interface, and basically you use that. Your logic is built right into there. As it says, these are ideal for simple projects because you can kind of get them together quickly. The biggest drawback, as mentioned there, is they can be difficult to maintain. They're not what is referred to typically as extensible. And the author mentions there that mixing the domain model and the business logic code in the user interface oftentimes leads to duplication, and if not duplication, oftentimes can lead to complexity that really probably doesn't need to be there. In the world of MVC, the Smart UI is often referred to as the anti-pattern, something that you should avoid when possible. All right, and the biggest weakness is maintainability. But again, if it's a small project, it might be ideal. The model view architecture, which is shown here, it's an improvement over the Smart UI because it pulls the business logic out into a separate domain model. All right. But as you can see in here, really there's no controller. So it's an improvement and it's easier to maintain, but as mentioned here on the top of page 55, it can introduce other problems. The first, as it says, is that since the UI and the domain model are closely integrated, it might be hard to perform unit testing on just one component. The second problem, it says the model typically contains a mass of data access code. All right? Not just business rules and operation. Classic three-tier architecture. Back when I was at the school I used to work at, we had a class called Client Server 1 and another called Client Server 2. And we had basically a three-tier architecture. As it says here, It separates the persistent code from the domain model, and it places it into a new component called the DAL, or Data Access Layer. We'll get into the Data Access Layer, which is typically done and typically created as its own folder, or maybe even its own assembly, in a MVC application. The three-tier architecture is the most widely used pattern for business applications. All right. Is it the best? Again, what the author has said in here is that he is really not making a call on what's the best. All right. Some variations on MVC. There's a couple that are shown here, starting on the bottom of page 55. And the first one is the MVP, or Model View Presenter pattern. As it says there, it's designed to fit easier with GUI platforms like Windows Forms. All right. So it says it tries to get the best aspects of a smart UI without making it too complex. In this pattern, as mentioned here, the presenter has the same responsibilities as the MVC controller. All right. There can be two implementations of this: passive, in which the view contains no logic, and supervising, where the view may be responsible for some of the elements of the presentation logic. So, the difference between these two approaches, as mentioned, is the amount of intelligence you add to the view. There's also MVVM, Model View ViewModel. As it says, it originated in Microsoft and is used in Microsoft's WPF, or Windows Presentation Foundation. The difference, it says, is the view model, an abstract representation of a user interface. Typically, a C# class that exposes properties for the data to be displayed in the UI and operations that can be placed on it. Now, again, used to teach a class many years ago. So many years ago, it was back when computer programming was referred to more as data processing, and the class was called Data Processing Logic. And one of the things that we tried to get across in that class was that when you build different things, they should be loosely coupled from one another. In other words, if I've got an application that I break into different units, ideally, I'll be able to change one of those units without it having any effect on the other units. If I do that, not only is it loosely coupled, but it'll make it easier for me to come in and actually use those components in different projects. So as mentioned here, one of the most important features of the MVC pattern is that it enables that separation of concerns. In an ideal situation, each component knows nothing about any other component. It's got its own job, and that's all it cares about. All right, this looks, to me at least, like it's a fairly good place to stop. So before we get into talking about dependency injection, I'll stop right now and we'll continue the discussion in the next part.